Today, we're going to be talking about gut health, how to build that up in a good way. But before we do, I think it's important we talk about why the microbiome is important. So let's kick it off there.
Oh, man. Well, first of all, Jesse, thank you for having me. I'm excited to connect with you and your audience. I feel like the microbiome is this scientific revolution that's taking place right now that is transforming the way that we think about medicine, thinking about biology, and even, thinking about the way that we interact with the world around us. And it's crazy because it comes from such a place of humility where, this is pretty much poop. That's kind of what we're talking about here. And 20 years ago, no one had any interest in this topic, poop, or how that could even possibly be anything of any value. And now here we are. And there was, effectively a laboratory breakthrough that we needed in 2006 to allow us to do this type of research. And at the same time, our computers caught up. And it allowed us to discover this world that is a part of our body that we previously were missing, covering our skin, inside our mouth, inside our nose, on our eyeball, believe it or not, but most concentrated inside of our colon, which is our large intestine. In that spot, you will find 38 trillion living microorganisms, mostly bacteria, also some fungi, but this is a complex, diverse ecosystem of life inside of us, not a part of the human body, and yet connected to the parts of human physiology that are so necessary for health, like connected to our digestion, which is access to nutrients, our metabolism, immune system, hormones, mood, brain health, energy levels, genetic expression. It's even as a medical doctor, I find it bizarre to think that the most important part of human health could be the part of us that's not even human. It's crazy.
Well, before we get into the specifics, how to build that up and to assess where we're at when it comes to our microbiome, let's talk about some of the biggest things in today's world that are impacting it in a negative way.
A lot has changed in the last 100 years. If you think about where we are today relative to where we were for our, perhaps great-grandparents, so much of what we spend our time doing just wasn't really there before. We didn't have cars. We didn't have electronics. We didn't have televisions or computers or smartphones. So you think about how much life has changed, and it's not just a lifestyle thing. Probably the biggest thing in terms of shaping and molding our microbiome are our dietary choices, the food that we put into our mouth. And the reason why this is so important is because your food choices ultimately will come into contact with these gut microbes. And so whatever is in that sort of mix of choices, whatever that big picture looks like, again, like one meal is not going to change everything for you. But one meal repeated multiple times over, that is going to change things. And, here we are, and the average person in North America is like 55 or 60% ultra-processed foods. They didn't exist 100 years ago, right? So we have shifted very, very quickly towards a wildly different dietary pattern. And it puts a strain on these microbes, particularly because part of, sort of my platform and my argument is that, like, for example, the idea of the paleo diet. Well, 100 years ago, you really had no choice. There were no processed foods. So you basically had to be some version of a paleo diet where it was basically meat and fruits and vegetables and whole grain seeds, nuts, and legumes. Like, that was it. And, now we have to create special dietary patterns to force or motivate people to eat the way that people did 100 years ago. And one of the things that we're really missing is fiber. And so fiber turns out to be, I think, crucial in terms of supporting and nurturing this community of microbes. And we can get into more of why that is, but the bottom line is that, here we are, and 95% of people in the United States don't get enough fiber. And a big part of the reason why is because we're eating this very high ultra-processed food diet.
Well, we're going to go deep into fiber today. And I think for a lot of people, they've heard the word fiber. They probably think of a supplement that maybe their mother or their grandmother had, that white powder that you mix into water to make sure you're having regular bowel movements. So let's break it down. Let's talk about what fiber is, start really top down, and then we'll get into some of the nuances.
Yeah. Fiber is due to be completely sort of remade in our minds. We have to let go of sort of the preconceptions of fiber of the past and acknowledge this new look fiber that is so exciting. Like, the science in this area is so exciting. And so what is fiber? Fiber, first of all, is a carbohydrate. If you were to look at the chemical structure, not to get super nerdy, but basically it's a whole bunch of sugar molecules that get linked together, but linked together in a complex way where it's like a very long chain of these sugar molecules that can't easily be disrupted or broken up. And you'll find fiber naturally occurring in nature. Like, it doesn't have to be this white powder thing. It's actually quite easy to find fiber in nature because every single plant species, whether you eat it or you don't eat it, has fiber. It naturally occurs and exists within plants. And they almost have a monopoly on fiber. There are exceptions. You can find fiber in mushrooms. Mushrooms technically are not plants, they're actually fungi. But like, aside from that, for example, in mammals, like we don't have fiber as a part of our body. It just is not there. So to keep it simple, we've broken it up into two main categories that you alluded to a moment ago, which is soluble and insoluble fiber. And these words, basically what they mean, soluble means that if you put it into a glass of water and you stir it, it will dissolve and it will disappear. Whereas insoluble fiber is more like the classic view of fiber, which is roughage, grit, something that just doesn't go away. And, the idea that most people have about fiber is it's like this inert thing that, yeah, you have it in your diet, but it just kind of sweeps through and then like, boom, launches out the other end like a torpedo, right? That's what people think fiber is. That's actually partially true, but it's missing the exciting part, which is that many types of fiber, particularly the soluble fiber, turns out to be food for our gut microbes. And it passes through the intestines unchanged because as complex as we are as humans, we actually lack the enzymes to break down fiber. But we have a microbiome. It lives inside of our colon. And that microbiome is actually something that we evolved with them, and we outsourced fiber digestion to them. This is actually their responsibility. We need them to do this for us. So fibers will basically work its way through your small intestine, which is, 15 feet, 5 meters long, and arrive into the colon. Boom, here come the microbes. And they get to work. And the enzymes that we lack, that we don't have, they have them. And they will start to apply those enzymes, working like literally as teams. Like, if you had a microscope and you zoomed in on fiber, you would see a team of working microbes all doing their part to break down and process it. And when they do this, a couple really special things happen. First, these microbes grow stronger. This is their food. We're actually feeding them. And they're as alive as you and I are. They need food. But the second thing is that they reward us. Thank you for giving me a meal. Let me do this to give you something back that's even better than what you gave me. And the reward are short-chain fatty acids, butyrate, acetate, propionate. And these are the most healing, most anti-inflammatory molecules that I have come across in my 20 years of study in medicine. And if you dig into the medical literature at all and start reading up on these things, you're going to be blown away by like how they are just all over the body having these healing effects. And the way that we get them is quite simply fiber in our diet coming into contact with microbes in our colon. So the short of it, Jesse, is that fiber is food for our gut bugs. And when our gut bugs are fed, they pay us back in spades with anti-inflammatory molecules.
It seems like lately there's been this trend of people, you talked about paleo, but taking that even further and having an all meat or carnivore diet. And now that we do have this technology to analyze the gut microbiome, I'm curious, have you seen any of the data? What is that showing with people that are having no fiber at all? And what they're doing is, like you explained, it would be starving the gut microbiome.
When it comes to questions about the gut microbiome, the thing that's interesting, actually, Jesse, is that there was a study done in 2014, and it was by a guy at Duke University. His name's Lawrence David. This was not, like, carnivore wasn't even part of our nutritional vernacular at the time. There's no such thing. But what he did in this study is he wanted to know, quite simply, can you change a person's microbiome by changing their diet? And he chose intelligently two polar extreme diets. One was a completely plant-based diet, high in fiber, obviously high in carbohydrates. And the opposite was an effectively almost zero carbohydrate, completely animal product-based diet. So meat, eggs, and dairy. And it's a quick study. It's only 5 days. There's obviously a lot more that I would love to do from a scientific perspective. This is just sort of a starting point. But what he did is he basically had people do these diets and then flip over and do the other diet. And he measured their microbiome every single day. And like, okay, let's track this. Let's see what happens in this microbiome. Here's what they found. So first of all, whatever diet you choose, the changes that you make in your diet will start to show up by tomorrow. Not a radical transformation in your microbiome, but there is a change. Your microbiome is changing that quickly within 24 hours. So that's really exciting. That's empowering. When people are on the plant-based diet, they saw basically increases in certain particular microbes. No surprise. These are the microbes that help us to break down and process fiber. If you were to look at these microbes, you would recognize many of the names. These are the same microbes that show up in many of our probiotic supplements. And the microbes were increasing the production of the short-chain fatty acids. And they actually saw that. They measured the short-chain fatty acids and saw that they increased. On the flip side, the animal product-based diet, again, 5 days. I would never argue that in 5 days, someone is radically injuring their gut. You need to do more than that. But there were some changes that I would describe as concerning. So there was a shift towards specific microbes that we call them bilophilic. Bilophilic basically means that they do really well on a high-fat diet. And this includes ones that have been associated with inflammatory bowel disease or with colon cancer or other inflammatory conditions that, frankly, people don't want. So the shift that took place was not a shift that people would describe as being advantageous. Additionally, I thought this was kind of interesting. They noticed that people on the animal product-based diet started to develop antibiotic resistance. So, my question to the audience at home is, why would that happen? Why would the meat and the eggs and the dairy cause antibiotic resistance?
CAFO meat, antibiotics injected into the animals.
Getting pumped up. So, particularly in the States, 80% of antibiotics that are produced are not given to humans. 80% are used as a part of animal agriculture. And so those antibiotic residues, if they're coursing through the bloodstream of the animal, or if they are accumulating in the fat of the animal, then they are a part of that product. And it's disturbing to consider that people are just trying to eat food and developing antibiotic resistance because our agricultural practices and our food systems are making it that way. Like, that to me is problematic. So anyway, that's what
Before you move on the other side to that coin too, you can imagine what those antibiotics are doing to the gut microbiome of that person.
100%.
So it's not only forming resistance against antibiotics if, those are used down the line, but you're destroying, my gut would tell me, no pun intended, that they're going to have an effect on your own gut microbiome in the present.
I don't think there's any doubt about that. And I do think that these gut health issues that exist, going back to an earlier question, like what has changed? These are complex questions. But when you start taking these individual things, here's one conversation, one point, antibiotics in the meat supply. And then we could talk about the ultra-processed foods and some of the chemicals that exist in there, right? And you just go down the line and it's like, unfortunately, these things, they really add up very quickly.
So we talked about antibiotics in the meats, whether it's from meat or taking an antibiotic. When we do that damage to the gut microbiome and we lose volume or different species, how do we go about bringing different species back in? So what I'm getting at here is, say we're eating a wide variety of fruits and vegetables. We're providing food for the microbiome that's down there. But what if we've lost key species because of some of these different things we've done throughout our life? How do we get those species back in there to then feed them with fiber over time and then build them back up?
These are questions. This question that you're asking right now is, I would say, is one of the foundational questions that we have not yet clearly answered. And the reason why we haven't, because we want to, is the limitations of our laboratory techniques as humans. So unfortunately, we're not God, and we don't see all and understand all. So we have to apply laboratory techniques to try to understand. But there's a lower level of how much those laboratory techniques can detect. So effectively what I'm saying is, if a microbe disappears where we no longer detect it, is the microbe gone? Or is it just so low that we can't detect it, like dormant? And we don't fully know this. What we do know is this. So Justin Sonnenberg, who's at Stanford University, he's doing a lot of the research in this area. And he actually did some work with the Hadza, which is a tribe of hunters and gatherers that live in Tanzania. And so the Hadza, many people have heard of the Hadza, but for those who have not, just in case, these people, they're living a pre-modern lifestyle, meaning like they don't have agriculture at all. They're foraging and they're hunting, and that's it. And when you look at their diet, they're not going to the supermarket. So it could be the summertime, and I may go to the store and buy apples, which is a fall food. Those clearly are not locally sourced, right? They wouldn't have access to that. They have to get whatever is locally available because they're foraging. And so when Sonnenberg studied them, he was looking at their microbiome. And what he noticed, which I find to be very exciting and interesting, is that there were certain microbes that were seasonal. They would disappear when the fruit, like let's say there was a specific berry. This berry is out of season. We can't find those microbes. Where did they go? But then the berry comes back in season, and guess what happens? The microbes come back. And so did those microbes like truly go extinct, or were they just dormant and waiting for their food supply to come back? I don't know. And I don't know that we have the ability to answer that question with clarity just yet. But what I do know is this. Number one, the microbiome is adaptable. When the berries come back, the microbiome changes in order to get that food supply and get the digestion up and running. Number two, when you eat a wide variety of different plants, you are feeding and serving a wider variety of these microbes. And so the berry is just one example, right? You're adding this berry back into your food supply, or you remove it and these microbes go away. Well, they've actually shown this in clinical research, Jesse, and it's not just one study, it's actually multiple studies at this point. But the most powerful study, and the one that I always cite, going back a few years ago, is called the American Gut Project. And the American Gut Project, by the way, is more than just an American thing. This was actually an international project of more than 11,000 people. All of them provided stool specimens, and all of them provided information about what they were eating and how they were living. And so the biggest study to date connecting microbes and diet and lifestyle. And when they did their analysis, they discovered that there was this one factor that was the most powerful thing in terms of determining whether or not you had a healthy gut. And that was the variety of plants in your diet. So specifically, people that were eating at least 30 varieties of plants per week were the ones who had the healthiest guts. And it comes back to this Sonnenberg idea that I was just describing in the Hadza, which is that when you add the different varieties of plants in, then you feed those microbes, whether they are dormant or extinct, they show up. And on the flip side, when you restrict your diet or you withdraw from variety, which, by the way, that would not make you unique as a person, that would make you normal in today's society. You are on a less diverse diet, and then you have a less diverse microbiome as a result of that. And the reason why diversity is such an important point is that we basically attribute the health of your microbiome to the diversity within your microbiome. So this becomes a very important factor.
The golden rule.
Yeah, this is the golden rule. So this is, I like to call it the golden rule because because no matter who you are, no matter what dietary pattern you follow, this is something that you can apply. And I think it's very tangible, very easy to follow, and can be potentially game-changing for a lot of people.
I want to make sure I highlight what you're saying here because it is very important. The fact that, because we talked about earlier, the fact there's soluble versus insoluble fiber. And what we're getting into now is it's even more complex than that. It's not just about getting this many grams of fiber, whether it be soluble, insoluble. Plant diversity matters. And having a diverse array of plants is what's going to make that microbiome flourish. So the way the medical system is simplified it, and whatever, I don't even know, you would know the number that they recommend getting grams of fiber a day. That is just so oversimplified because it's well beyond a number. We got to get the diversity of plants on a regular basis.
100%. 100%. So, essentially what you're saying and what I am backing up is stop counting grams of fiber. Start counting plants. That's what matters. You could eat a diet that's exclusively kale. And kale is reportedly the healthiest food on the planet, or the most nutrient dense food on the planet. And that is a horribly unhealthy diet. You need variety. And when you fall into the trap of just counting grams of fiber, you're engineering your diet in a way that actually, can it help a person who's fiber deficient? Of course it can, right? You can still move in the right direction by simply adding more grams of fiber. But really what you want is instead to focus on the varieties of plants. And when you eat a wider variety of plants, not only are you going to get the grams of fiber, but you're also going to get all the different phytochemicals and polyphenols and all the other good stuff that you get from all of these different plants. They all have something different that they can offer you, and it's good for your health.
And when it comes to diversity, one thing I found really fascinating in your book was where you talked about plants having their own microbiome. So let's talk about how that works and how that goes about interacting with our microbiome. And another layer on that, is that a piece of why the diversity matters?
Dude, it gets so crazy when you start thinking about the scope of this. So first of all, the first life on this planet was not a dinosaur. Though they're actually very recent in terms of the history of Mother Earth. The first life on this planet, we believe, were archaea. Archaea showed up about 4 billion years ago. There's a dig site in Greenland where they found them. And it's interesting. So 4 billion years. We've only had oxygen for about 2.5 billion years. Archaea were living on a scorched earth that didn't even have oxygen for 1.5 billion years before this even happened. Microbes have been there from the beginning. That's my point. Microbes have been there from the beginning. The very first human, whoever this person was, whatever we want to name this person, they had a microbiome. Every living human has had a microbiome, but all life on this planet has a microbiome. Not just humans, but also plants and bugs and the soil and the ocean. They're everywhere. They've actually studied the apple microbiome, believe it or not, Jesse. And an apple has about 100 million microbes. So anyway, these microbes, they help this fruit to flourish and to turn into an apple. And, potentially that apple gets consumed, or the apple falls to the ground and it decays. The microbes are part of that process too. And they get broken down and turned into new soil. And that is the circle of life. And it just continually reinvents itself. There's new research that came out recently, Jesse, that did not make it into my first book, but just to kind of put into perspective, like how these microbes are literally everywhere. There's new research that a tumor, a cancer tumor, has a microbiome. And believe it or not, what they're discovering is that the microbiome of the tumor affects your response to chemotherapy and can affect survival of a person. So I'm not talking about the microbiome within the gut of the person who has cancer. I'm talking about if you actually sample the cancer, you will discover that cancer has a microbiome too. So it's fascinating to consider that these microbes, they're just everywhere. And you walk out in nature. This is why going outside is so important. Because inside our homes that you and I are sitting in right now, these are man-made structures. And they're not alive. And they don't have a microbiome. There may be some microbes kind of hanging around, but there's actually not that many of them relative to if you walk outside and there's a tree. And you just walk within proximity to that tree actually is emanating microbes. And you will be sharing microbes with that tree. You just don't even realize it, but you do. Or you walk on the ground and you're sharing microbes with the ground. Like it's, I don't know. I think it really makes you feel very connected, very much more than an isolated individual exists on the planet, but instead a part of the planet. And also, I think it validates a lot of the research that exists that say things like, taking a walk outside, or a forest bath, or putting your feet into the ground, or gardening. It just starts to feel like, wow, these connections, they're not just like a hippie thing, they're real. And we just didn't understand them because we couldn't see the microbes with our own eye, but they're there.
That's fascinating stuff. And coming back to that tumor example, I don't know if the research has been done, but how does different tumors have different microbiomes? You wonder if that has something to do with the host and their microbiome. So does it go even further? Like how, very complex, and we won't have answers to all this, but it's interesting to think about.
I don't have an answer to that, but our blood is not as sterile as we think it is. There is a barrier, and that barrier is your gut. The wall of your gut separates, the these 38 trillion microbes living inside your intestine from the bloodstream. But that barrier can also be injured. And this is what you read about when you read about leaky gut. So there is some exchange where microbes can get access to the bloodstream. And perhaps that's part of how the tumor ultimately develops a microbiome. The microbes are everywhere. So like the bloodstream is not completely sterile. But what they have found is that if you look at the diversity, so we were talking a moment ago about diversity in the gut and how like increased diversity is a measure of health. So like the Hadza have far more diverse microbiome than any Western human. And a loss of diversity is associated with disease. So like if you take a human gut and you look at the diversity of people who have, for example, Crohn's disease or ulcerative colitis, you will find that they have reduced diversity within their gut. Well, if you look at a tumor microbiome, so not the gut anymore, we're talking about the tumor itself. What they found is that the tumor has diversity. And when there's a loss of diversity within the tumor microbiome, those are the tumors that don't respond to chemotherapy. So it's a poor prognostic indicator when you have a poor diversity within the microbiome. It's crazy. we're just getting started.
That's what I was going to say. You can only imagine 10 years from now where we're going to be.